Welcome back. We are on Chapter 4, Medical, Legal, and Ethical Issues. Topics we're going to go over are going to be the scope of practice, patient consent and refusals, and other legal issues. In this section, we will discuss the scope of practice. Scope of practice. The EMT is governed by many medical, legal, and ethical guidelines. This collective set of regulations and ethical considerations may be referred to as the scope of practice, which defines the extent and limits of the EMT's job. The skills and the medical interventions the EMTs may perform are defined by legislation that varies from state to state. Sometimes different regions within the state may have different rules and guidelines for their EMTs, so be sure that you understand the rules and guidelines that govern your area. It may include skills and medical interventions, and again, defining by state legislation and regional rules and guidelines. You always look back to what your scope of practice is at the facility that you're working for. The standard of care is care that would be expected from an EMT with similar training when caring for a patient in a similar situation. So the scope of practice is what you can do, but the standard of care is how you should do it. In this next section, we're going to talk about patient consent and refusals. This is very, very important to understand. So let's talk about consent. So consent is permission from the patient to assess, treat, and transport them. Express consent must be informed. An implied consent means that it is assumed. So say that you have a 40-year-old male who's unresponsive. That is where the implied consent comes in, that he can't necessarily make the determination that he wants you to transport or not, but you're assuming or implied that if he was in the right state of mind, he would want you to help him in the situation that he's in right now. The other part of it is with children and mentally incompetent adults. Minors are not legally permitted to provide consent or refusal for treatment. So you have to obtain from a parent or a legal guardian the permissions to do so. The possible exceptions would be to check your local laws, obviously, and then in local parentheses and emancipated minors. So what are those? So essentially what happens is with the in local parenthesis is literally in place of a parent, indicating that a patient who may give consent for care of a child when a parent is not present or able to give consent. And then the emancipated minors are actually minors who are under the age of 18 who decide to go to court to be considered an emancipated minor, meaning they can make their own decisions for themselves and so forth. Possible exceptions are life-threatening illnesses or injuries, minors who have their own children, and minors who are serving in the armed forces. So these would be your exceptions, but again, checking your local laws and protocols is always the best option. Involuntary transportation is when the patient is considered a threat to themselves or others. They may have court orders, usually requires a decision by a mental health professional or even a police officer to put them on a hold. And then if the patient is restrained, you want to ensure that the patient's health and well-being is taken care of during this time. Although patients generally have the right to refuse care, it is still your responsibility as an EMT to be sure that the patients are fully informed about their situation and the implications of refusing care. So in order for a patient to refuse care or transport, several conditions must be fulfilled. So first and foremost, the patient must be legally able to consent. That means they are of legal age, 18 or above, or an emancipated minor. Next is the patient must be alert, awake, and oriented, and they must not be affected by any disease or condition that would impair their judgment, including the unstable vital signs, alcohol intoxication, or influence of drugs, or maybe they have an altered mental status. They must also be fully informed. They must have the mental capacity to understand the situation and the potential consequences of refusing care. And then they must be asked to sign a release form, such as a form designated to release the ambulance agency and individuals from any liability or legal responsibility that may arise from the patient's informed refusal. If you do this, I always encourage you to have a family member, a friend, law enforcement, somebody else be there as the witness when you're giving them the instructions and fully informing them so that they can say, yes, they did tell you this information. However, on your report, you must document everything that you tell them. And on the piece of paper that they sign, you must document everything that you tell them or that you inform them of so that when they sign it, the person, their family or law enforcement or whomever sign it, saying, hey, we witnessed that they told you that if you get left here after a motor vehicle accident, that you could potentially have a fractured spine or head injury, and now you're refusing to do this. So just be very, very clear with them and be very precise in your documentation on what you tell them. If you didn't tell them that information, then you cannot report it and you cannot put it on there. You want to take all possible actions, though, to persuade the patient to accept care and transport. Spend time speaking with the patient. Listen carefully to try to determine why the patient is refusing care. And inform the patient of the consequences of not going to the hospital. This is a very essential component of every refusal of care situation. And it might mean that you may tell them if you don't go to the hospital because you are having cardiac issues, you could die. And that's okay. Tell them that. Be very clear and use the word death, dead, dying. It just gives them a whole nother aspect of the meaning of the importance of actually being transported. Next, you want to take all possible actions to persuade them to accept it because you need to consult medical direction. You also need to ask the patient if it's all right if you call a family member, or advise the patient that you would like to call a family member to give them the information that, hey, we've been called out to your family member. This is what's going on. We've informed them that these are the consequences. However, they're still refusing to go in. They're still refusing care. Maybe that family member can actually talk them into going in if you feel it's necessary. If needed, call law enforcement personnel and then ask the patient to sign the refusal form used by your agency. Some forms are standardized, but others come directly from your agency. So always know where that form is, because you should never leave a patient without them signing a consent form or a patient refusal form. So here's something to think about. What are the risks of beginning treatment and or transport without getting consent from that patient? And then what happens if the patient refuses to sign that refusal of care form? What could happen? Just think about that. When a patient refuses care, you're subjecting them to any unwanted care and transport that has actually been viewed in a court that could potentially be considered assault or battery. So if you keep pushing them and you don't allow them to refuse, they could get very frustrated and you could be charged with assault or battery. So just be very cautious and conscious of how you are trying to get them to go in. Have those witnesses to that refusal and then inform that patient if they change their mind, they can always call back and that you would be happy to transport them. Again, if possible, have a friend or relative remain with them and document any attempts very thoroughly that you made. But if you don't document it, it didn't happen. You will hear that a lot throughout this course. If documentation is key in everything that you do. How about a do not resuscitate order and a physician's order for life-sustaining treatment, or a POLST form? So they are legal document expressing the patient's wishes if the patient is unable to speak for him or herself. So a DNR, or a do not resuscitate order, may be part of an advance directive. It may also be a part of a physician's order for life-sustaining treatment, or a POLST form. This should also be familiar with living wills and healthcare proxies. So if you happen to go to a facility, say an assisted living for instance, if you don't know or you're not familiar with it, go back to your department and actually research it or ask questions and be familiar with these living wills and healthcare proxies, because this is going to tell you what the patient wants for their end of life care. In this section, we're going to talk about other legal issues. So what is negligence? Negligence is something that should have been done but was not done or was done incorrectly. That is considered negligence. So it must prove that the EMT had a duty to act, or a breach of duty, which the EMT failed to provide that standard care that was expected, or they failed to act. Now, this gets a little bit tricky, because if you are paged out, this is when this would come into play. If you are outside of your service area, you're off duty, whatever else, you're only required to call 911. However, if somebody knows you and whatever else, they might beg to differ. And it all goes back to anybody can be sued for any reason. It's just, what is the law going to cover you at? And what is your peers? If you put 100 of your peers in the same room and put them in the exact same situation that you're in, did you do what you should have done, or did you do what you should not have done? Or was it done incorrectly? So with negligence, they must prove the proximate causation, meaning the patient suffered harm because the EMT's actions or inactions. And then the negligent EMTs may be required to pay those damages. So again, you're not 100% covered under your service, and so that's why I highly recommend people to get their own liability insurance as working as an EMT, because you never know when you could potentially get sued. So lawsuits against EMTs are usually classified as torts, which is a civil, not a criminal offense, where it's an action or an injury caused by negligence from which a lawsuit may arise. Remember, people can sue for anything, for any reason. It's just if you're going to get charged with it or not. And then the other one is res ipsa loquitur. Totally probably mutilated that one. But in English, it is actually considered the thing that speaks for itself. So the legal concept is important in the negligent cases. Next is the duty to act. So it's your obligation to provide care to a patient. Your duty to act is not always clear though. So off duty versus on duty, but out of jurisdiction. So it gets really kind of sketchy, but yes, it is something that we will definitely talk a lot about throughout this course. But you always want to make sure you're following your local protocols, your local laws, and follow your own conscience on if you should do it or if you shouldn't. Next is abandonment. It's once the care is initiated, it may not be discontinued until transfer to medical personnel of equal or greater training arrives. So failure to do so may constitute abandonment, which is leaving the patient in the hands of somebody with less training than what you are. So just be very careful that if you decide that you're going to start treatment on a patient outside of your service area, you are making sure that it is at least your level or above before you stop or discontinue the care you're giving. Good Samaritan laws is the next one, and that is the grant of immunity from liability if the rescuer acts in good faith within the level of training. But it may not cover EMTs in some situations. And it does not protect persons from gross negligence or violations of the law. So you have to follow the law to be covered under the Good Samaritan. So a couple things to think about. You arrive on the scene of a patient in cardiac arrest. The family says that she has a DNR, but they don't know where it is. How should you handle the situation? Next one is you are off duty and arrive on the scene of a vehicle crash. Police and EMS have not yet arrived. Are you legally obligated to stop and render care? Let's discuss this in class. Confidentiality. This is going to be something that we are going to talk about over and over and over and over again. Confidentiality is the obligation not to reveal information obtained about a patient except to other healthcare professionals directly involved in the patient care or under subpoena or in a court order of law or when the patient has signed a release of confidentiality. So it is the information on the patient's history, condition, treatment. These are all considered confidential. You cannot go take care of a patient and go to your social media page and put on there what you did with that patient. You cannot go to your local little round table at the local restaurant and talk about that because somebody in that restaurant may hear you and it could be their family member. So just be very careful that you are confidential with every single patient that you ever come in contact with. Next is the privacy rule of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is also known as HIPAA, which includes the privacy rule that protects the privacy of the patient, specific healthcare information, and providing the patient with control over how this information is used and distributed. So information shared with other healthcare personnel as the part of the patient's continuing care is fine. Otherwise, it must be obtained through a subpoena. Medical identification devices. These are simple little devices that a lot of people forget to look for, but it is an example of a medication or a medical identification device that may talk about their medications that they're on. It might talk about their medical conditions or medical alerts that you must be aware of, from diabetic to allergic reactions to cardiac issues and so on. So for particular medical conditions, they might have a necklace or a bracelet. They might even have a card in their purse or their wallet. Some conditions are, again, the heart conditions, allergies, diabetes, or epilepsy. So another special situation is organ donors. So with that, it's a completed legal document allowing the donation of organs and tissues in the event of their death. It may be identified by family members, a donor card, or a driver's license. The receiving hospital and/or medical direction should be advised per protocol. Another special situation is the safe haven laws. So most states have implemented some sort of a safe haven law, which under such law, a person may permanently leave an infant or a child at any police, fire, or EMS station, or deliver the infant or child to any available public safety personnel. And each state has different guidelines, so depending on where you're working, you want to check that out. But that could be different guidelines for the ages of the children, included that's under that act. So typically it's usually infants to young children. But just be sure that you know and understand that if you're working and somebody drops off a child and walks away, there's not really anything that you can do about that. That is what the safe haven law is all about. So it is made to protect the children who may otherwise be abandoned or harmed by their parents because they're unwilling or unable to care for them. Crime scenes. So crime scenes is defined as the location where the crime has been committed or any place where evidence relating to a crime may be found. Many crime scenes involve crimes against people. These crimes cause injuries that are often serious. But once the police have made the scene safe, the EMT's priorities at the scene is to provide patient care. Know what evidence is and take the steps to preserve it. You want to see the condition of that scene, and you want to be sure that the law enforcement has all the necessary means to get, the suspect, if at all possible. You want to also protect that patient as well. Examples of evidence could be the condition of the scene. It might be the patient. It could be fingerprints or footprints, or even microscopic evidence that's kind of hard to see with the naked eye. Anytime you are on a crime scene, you want to preserve the evidence at all costs. So remember what you touch. If it is moved, remember where you moved it to and from. Minimize your impact on the scene and work with the police. As an EMT, you also have special reporting requirements. If you're in tune with any child, elderly, or domestic abuse, you are required to report that. Any human trafficking, violence with gunshots, stabbings, sexual assault, and any situations where restraint may be necessary. These are all reportable situations. You also may have to report intoxicated persons with any injuries. It could be from a snowmobile, four-wheeler, ATV, motor vehicle, and so forth. Or any injuries whatsoever. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a motor vehicle. It could be, gunshot or whatever. Any mentally incompetent people with injuries. And then you, of course, want to check your local protocols and laws to be sure that you're doing everything the appropriate way. Other ethical responsibilities. Many of the topics discussed in this chapter have been both legal and ethical implications, but there are a few topics that still need to be addressed. Morality refers to the personal opinions and beliefs about what is right and wrong. Ethics is when speaking about a profession refers to standard of behavior for those who participate in that profession. And some of the ethical expectations of an EMT could be included. Your biggest one is being honest in your reporting. If it didn't happen, it should not be in your report. You want to refrain from actions that cause harm to the patient. First is do no harm. This sounds obvious, but another way to think of this is to say that if you're going to make a mistake, make it a reversible one. For example, when in doubt about whether to start CPR in general, is better to start and then stop after information is available than to refrain initially and start CPR later when it is much less effective. And next, to help the patient. Working to help the patient, which includes putting the patient's interests above your interests and your comfort. Respecting the right of adult patients to make decisions on their own behalf when they are informed and able to make decisions. You want to be able to treat all patients fairly and justly without regard to sex, race, ability to pay, and other conditions as described by laws and ethical codes. You also want to assist others as appropriate to learn your profession. This does not mean that you have to become an EMT instructor or a preceptor, but once you become an EMT, you should be able to deal with EMT students in a fair and respectable manner. Just remember, where you guys are sitting today may be where another person is sitting in 4 or 5 years from now when you have the experience out on the truck. So take into consideration how you feel today learning this stuff as a brand new concept. That's how your EMT students in 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 years are going to feel. So keep that in the back of your mind. And then reporting any misconduct that affects or may affect the patient care. And making sure if you participate in research that it is approved by the appropriate authorities and that you understand it well enough to avoid inflicting harm. Let's review this chapter. Medical, legal, and ethical issues are a part of everyday EMS calls. Consent may be expressed or implied. If patients who are awake and oriented have the capacity to fully understand their situation, refuse care or transport, you should make every effort to persuade them, but you cannot force them to accept care or go to the hospital. Negligence is failing to act properly when you have a duty to act. As an EMT, you have a duty to act whenever you are dispatched on a call. You may have a legal or moral duty to act even when off duty or outside of your jurisdiction. Abandonment is leaving a patient after you have initiated care and before you have transferred the patient to a person with equal or higher training. Confidentiality is the obligation not to reveal personal information you obtain about a patient except to other healthcare professionals involved in the patient's care, under court order, or when the patient signs a release. As an EMT, you may be sued or held legally liable on any of these issues. However, EMTs are rarely held liable when they have acted within their scope of practice and according to the standard of care, and have carefully documented the details of the call. At a crime scene, care of the patient takes precedence over the preservation of evidence. However, you should make every effort to not disturb the scene unnecessarily and report your actions and observations to the police. EMTs must use good judgment and decision-making skills when dealing with the patient consent and refusal. Avoiding negligence implies using good judgment. Critical thinking is an essential component of avoiding liability. Remember, EMTs hold a responsibility of patients' protected health information. Exercising care when dealing with this information is a legal and ethical obligation. Here are a few questions to consider. Define scope of practice, negligence, duty to act, abandonment, and confidentiality. These will all be on your test, so be sure you know the difference between each one. What steps must you take when a patient refuses care or transportation? This here is another thing to keep in consideration because you will see on tests. And what types of evidence may be found at a crime scene? And how should you act to preserve the evidence? Here's a critical thinking. You respond to a motor vehicle crash and find a seriously injured patient. He has no pulse and you are about to begin CPR when someone says, "Don't do that." He's got cancer and a DNR. No one has the DNR at scene. Do you start CPR and transport the patient? If you said don't start CPR, you will fail. If they do not have a DNR and it's not with them, you are obligated to start CPR. However, if somebody comes up with the DNR, say it's the spouse and she has a kid at home, and she calls that child and says, "Take a picture of that DNR and send it to me," and she shows you that, you can potentially call into medical direction, tell them that you've seen the DNR on a picture and that you are wondering if you're allowed to stop. Always fall back on medical direction if you're not sure. But if they tell you to stop, that he's got cancer and not to do CPR, if they don't have the DNR, you are obligated to start.